Hi, welcome to Module 2. I hope everyone had a great weekend. It's kind of hard to believe that we're beginning the third week of school and Module 2. I want to take a few minutes to just talk about some of my observations of the material that we're going to be talking about in Module 2. Module 1 really introduced you to some of the very basic things in conflict. Much like a movie trailer, it just gave you a flavor for conflict and where we'll be going. Module 2 and several of the modules afterwards will be focusing much more in depth on elements and issues that are critical in order for us to address and manage conflict effectively. The Chinese symbol for conflict has two sides to it, and you may have heard of this before. One side is opportunity, and as the book points out, conflict always presents us with a number of exciting opportunities for growth. But the other side of the Chinese symbol is danger, and I want us all to recognize that in any conflict, there's the potential that it goes wrong, that it becomes dangerous, that it doesn't work the way that we hoped. In part, communication is really an underlying element that makes the difference in whether we achieve that opportunity in conflict or whether it becomes problematic and potentially dangerous. As I've worked with individuals over a number of years, helping them with conflict, and also as I've looked at my own conflict, one of the elements that I think is most important to consider, and your book in chapters 2 and 3 spend a lot of time on this, is perception. I oftentimes say, much to the dismay many times of people that I'm working with, that there is no truth. There's only our perception of truth. And I think that that is absolutely accurate. Based on our worldview, our lens, as the authors of our text describe it, we all bring different perceptions to a conflict situation. And those perceptions are influenced by our families, as we realized in Chapter 1 and Module 1, as we started to think about our family rules of conflict. But it's also influenced by our gender, by the culture, the ethnic element of who we are. It's influenced by our experiences, not just in our family, but also with other relationships and also at work. All of those experiences, all of those contextual elements come together to influence how we see a conflict. And how we see a conflict is oftentimes very different than how others in that same conflict may view it. We see that on the national stage sometimes. The recent conflicts in Ferguson, I think, are a great example of that. It is hard for me, as a person who is middle class, who is white, to understand the Black experience. And I think that there are multiple perspectives even in communities of color as they look at an experience like Ferguson. So if we come with very different perspectives, what do we need to do? How can we ever manage those perceptions as we work on conflict? And one of the ways that's critical is communication. We need to acknowledge that how we see a conflict is tentative. How others view that conflict is different than our own potentially. And we have to lay that out. Here's how I see the conflict, here's how I feel about it, but then open it up to how others may perceive it and what their experiences are. Until we're able to recognize our own perceptions and also recognize the tentativeness of those perceptions and other people's perspectives as well, it's challenging to manage conflict. Okay, we just talked about communication as it relates to conflict and perception. Let's talk about conflict communication a little bit more. Your book spends a great deal of time expanding on framing and how we frame conflicts. The book talks about the metaphors that we use as we describe a conflict. It talks about the stories or the narration, because whenever we're in a conflict, we create a story or a narrative about that conflict. That's communication. We communicate about how we see that conflict. Narration and conflict framing has become a really important discourse in conflict circles. How we understand people's narratives about conflict and the role they play in our ability to manage conflict, but also how we help people change their narrative or change their frame. That sounds easy, it's not, but it's a really powerful tool in managing conflict. If you were intrigued by the discussion in your textbook, I really encourage you to look at some of the supplemental information that I provided for Module 2, a couple particularly that you might want to look at. An older book that's been updated a couple of times, The Metaphors We Live By, is really a powerful and interesting book that relates directly to metaphors and conflict. Additionally, a book called Narrative Mediation, which you may think, wait a minute, that's about mediation, and this class is about conflict. In fact, that book focuses very dramatically on narratives in conflict situations, their power, and how we can think about changing them. Communication isn't just about framing and narratives, and I want you to spend a great deal of time in this module thinking about and looking about what Hocker and Wilmot describe as patterns of communication that occur in conflict interactions. Look at what they see as both positive patterns, and they talk about it's hard for us oftentimes to see those positive patterns, but also the negative patterns, equally hard to see and many times very challenging to change. Finally, I want you to think about the fact that one of the things that your textbook authors say is that we think of conflict negatively. So what we pay attention to and what we define and describe as conflict are all those times when conflict goes awry. Equally, they say rarely do we think about those times that conflict are managed well as being conflict at all. Many times we think about those as being disagreements, or they're not even on our radar screen. And it's because we've handled them so effectively that we move along easily. I want you in this module to be paying attention to your own interactions, not only paying attention to the negative things that happen in conflict, but also thinking about those conflicts that you have that are positive, that go very well, that you might not even define as a conflict. Enjoy this module. I look forward with dialoguing with you in the discussions, and I'll see you next week.